Australia's story begins not in 1788, but over 60,000 years ago, with the world's oldest continuous cultures, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who lived in deep connection with the land, sharing stories through the dreaming and building complex societies long before European eyes ever looked south. Then came the outsiders, first the Dutch, then the British, who claimed the eastern coast under the myth of Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one. In 1788, the first fleet arrived, turning the continent into a penal colony. But what followed was more than just a place of exile. It was a continent transformed by conflict, gold rushes, migration, resistance, rebellion, and ambition. Through hardship and violence, exploration and industry, Australia grew into a patchwork of colonies, and by 1901, those scattered settlements united to become a federated nation. But beneath the surface lies a deeper story, of land, power, and voices long silenced, still shaping what Australia means today. But before we continue, I'd like you to take a moment and let me know where you're watching from, what time it is for you, and if you're listening to fall asleep or just to pass the time while learning something new about history. I always read every comment, and it's always fascinating to see where and how people tune in. And if you enjoy the stories I tell, the quiet dive into the past, consider liking the video and subscribing to support me in making more content like this. It really helps more than you know. Alright, let's keep going. The land we now call Australia was never empty, never silent. Long before British ships sliced the surf at Botany Bay, the continent pulsed with stories, songlines, and lives deeply tied to its red soil and endless skies. This isn't just a preface to colonization, it's the heart of the story. What we begin to unfold now is not the tale of a blank slate awaiting European ink, but of an ancient tapestry woven over more than 60,000 years by the world's oldest continuous cultures. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples lived across this vast continent in thousands of nations, each with their own languages, laws, and lands. The word Aboriginal itself is a simplification, a label placed atop a far more complex reality. There were over 250 distinct language groups, and many more dialects within them. These were not isolated bands of nomads, but richly interlinked societies with thriving trade routes, environmental knowledge systems, and sophisticated social structures. One cannot speak of Aboriginal history without speaking of country. That's the term used, not just land, but country, a living entity with which people have a reciprocal relationship. It is parent, teacher, and kin. Every mountain, river, and stretch of desert has its own story, its own place in the dreaming, the spiritual and cultural framework through which indigenous peoples understand their origins, their responsibilities, and their world. The dreaming, or dreamtime, isn't merely mythology. It's a way of understanding existence, time past, present, and future, all entwined in a sacred narrative web. It's not a history that ends. It continues in ceremony, song, and story. Some of these stories stretch back to real geological events. For instance, oral histories from the Gunditjmara people, in what is now Victoria, tell of volcanic eruptions, and indeed evidence shows the region's last eruption occurred about 37,000 years ago, in line with those narratives. And there is material evidence as well. Near Lake Mungo in New South Wales, the remains of Mungo man and Mungo lady, dated to over 40,000 years ago, show not just human presence, but cultural depth, ceremonial burials, use of ochre, and ritual cremation. The site is one of the oldest known burial grounds in the world. Trade networks stretched across the continent, connecting the rainforest peoples of the north with desert clans in the interior, and coastal fishers to inland foragers. Ochre from the Flinders Ranges has been found hundreds of kilometers from its source. Shells from the coast turned up in the heart of the desert. These were not primitive societies, but deeply organized ones, sustained by oral law and collective stewardship. Seasonal calendars, based on local environmental patterns, were handed down through generations. In Arnhem Land, the Yolngu people recognized 6 seasons, not 4, based on winds, tides, and blooming plants. Knowledge of when to burn country for regeneration, a practice now recognized as cultural burning, was precise and ecologically astute. For tens of thousands of years, this land was not simply inhabited, it was curated. And then, there were the visitors. Before Cook, before even the Dutch, there were others. The Macassans, Muslim traders from what is now Indonesia, journeyed to the northern coast of Australia to harvest trepang, or sea cucumber. They came in large wooden boats, called perahu, and established trade relationships with the Yolngu and other northern clans. These were not fleeting encounters. They left behind iron tools, new words in local languages, and stories that became part of local songlines. The Macassans respected indigenous law, paid for their use of the land and sea, and often formed long-term relationships. Imagine that. An international trade route, long before European maps even dared suggest a great southern land. And yet, much of this history would later be buried beneath the myths of discovery and civilization. There are stone fish traps at Brewarina, on the Barwon River, in what is now New South Wales. They're believed to be over 40,000 years old. These complex stone constructions are older than the Egyptian pyramids. They demonstrate communal effort, deep understanding of river ecology, and intergenerational engineering, all to trap and manage fish sustainably. But how often is that taught in school? How often do we consider these systems as part of the Australian canon? The colonization of this land would come wrapped in words like progress, settlement, and terra nullius. A legal fiction claiming no one owned the land because no one farmed it in the European style. That idea would be used to justify taking everything. But here, in these early whispers of time, we can still hear the truth. The land was not empty. It was full of knowledge, life, ceremony, and memory. In the Kimberley, rock paintings depict giant thylacines, long extinct. In Tasmania, middens, ancient heaps of shells, line the coast, tracing centuries of gathering and feasting. In the central desert, sacred sites dot the sand like starlight, each linked to a song, each part of a map you must sing to navigate. Even the stars themselves were charts for travel and calendars for harvest. When the British finally arrived, they encountered a world that was already ancient, already known, already named. Some settlers recognized this. Watkin Tench, a British Marine officer with the First Fleet, wrote in 1793, "We are become invaders of the country. The natives do not appear to understand us." His journals, among others, offer rare glimpses of early misunderstandings and conflicts. But before we arrive at that first fateful landing, before white sails gleamed on the horizon, we must understand that Australia was never a blank slate. It was a continent alive with meaning, and it still is. These ancient foundations aren't just the past, they're part of the living present. In every dance, and every elder's story, in every sacred site that remains protected or under threat, there echoes a quiet truth. This land has always told stories, and now we begin to listen more carefully. Even as Indigenous Australians lived out their countless generations in rhythm with the land, half a world away, cartographers, scholars, and seafarers had begun sketching the outline of a continent they had never seen. For centuries, Europe dreamed of a vast, mysterious landmass at the bottom of the world, Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. They believed, almost by necessity, that such a place must exist. Ancient Greek thinkers, including Ptolemy, had reasoned that the earth must be balanced. If there were large continents in the north, then surely something just as massive must lie to the south. It was more a philosophy of symmetry than a science of exploration. But the idea stuck. By the 15th and 16th centuries, with the age of discovery sweeping across the oceans, European maps were often adorned with elegant drawings of this southern land. Mythical mountains, forests, and beasts included, but no one had proof. And yet the belief persisted, lurking just beneath the polished ink of the maps, a seductive promise of wealth, power, or simply the satisfaction of revealing the final piece of the Earth's puzzle. It was the Portuguese who first sailed close. Their ships traced the northern coasts of Australia sometime in the early 1500s, though they left behind few records. Some historians believe fragments of secret Portuguese maps show parts of what is now Western Australia. If they did make landfall, they chose not to broadcast it. The Dutch, however, were more methodical and more documented. In 1606, a Dutch vessel named the Dijfken, captained by Willem Janszoon, became the first recorded European ship to make landfall on the Australian mainland. He sailed along the western side of Cape York Peninsula and what is now Queensland. He and his crew encountered the Wick people, and it did not go well. There were violent clashes, and at least one of Janszoon's men was killed. He turned back, unimpressed with the coastline, and unaware he had just brushed the edge of an entire continent. Janszoon didn't recognize it as part of a larger landmass. To him, it was a forbidding shore with little to offer. He recorded little more than a few place names and brief, frustrated remarks. But that journey opened the door. Over the next few decades, more Dutch explorers followed. They were part of the Dutch East India Company, wealthy, powerful, and deeply interested in trade routes to the East Indies. In 1616, Dirk Hartog landed on what's now known as Dirk Hartog Island, off the coast of Western Australia. He left behind a pewter plate hammered with his name and the date, one of the oldest known European artifacts in Australia. It's a quiet kind of legacy, really, leaving a metal disc on a wind-lashed rock, but it marked a moment of contact, and contact, even when it passes unnoticed, changes everything. Hartog's voyage was followed by others, Frederick de Houtman, young Carstens, and most famously, Abel Tasman. In 1642, Tasman sailed south and west from the Dutch East Indies and became the first European to sight what is now Tasmania, which he named Van Diemen's Land after the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies. He then sailed east and reached New Zealand, but never set foot on mainland Australia. His journeys were monumental in European eyes, but they skirted the edges, like fingers trailing the rim of a bowl, never quite dipping inside. Still, the Dutch named the western half of the continent New Holland, a name that would persist for centuries. But they never settled it. It's strange, isn't it? They had the maps, they had the ships, but they didn't see the land as profitable. There were no spices, no gold, no dense cities to conquer. Just harsh coastlines, unfamiliar animals, and people who did not yield easily to European expectations. One Dutch ship, the Batavia, ran aground on the Houtman-Abrolhos Islands off the western Australian coast in 1629. What followed was a mutiny, mass murder, and one of the grimmest episodes in maritime history. Survivors described the land as desolate, the climate unforgiving, and the atmosphere cursed. Perhaps tales like this made Dutch officials cautious. This was not a land that welcomed intruders. Spanish and French ships passed by as well, but none laid serious claim. The early European view of the continent was fragmented, a piece of coastline here, a stormy passage there. They mapped in fits and starts, stitching together a rough outline that never quite felt complete. A jagged silhouette, a promise unfulfilled. Meanwhile, indigenous knowledge of the land remained detailed, layered, and intimately tied to every landscape feature. Their maps weren't drawn with ink and parchment, but told through story, song, and movement. Sunlines, or dreaming tracks, carried vital geographic and spiritual knowledge. These oral maps could guide a person across hundreds of kilometers, through deserts and forests, all by verse. A line of melody might describe a bend in a river, a stand of trees, or the presence of water beneath rock. And these stories were not only practical, but sacred, threads in a great cosmic fabric. It's a stark contrast, really. The European obsession with defining land on a two-dimensional page versus the indigenous practice of living within the story of the land. One was about possession, the other about relationship. By the late 1600s, maps began to take a clearer shape, but there were still gaps, vast, haunting blank spaces across the center and east. These were often labeled simply as unknown. And in many ways they remained so, until one voyage in 1770 would change everything. Because the next footsteps to land on this soil would not belong to the Dutch, or the Spanish, or the Portuguese. They would come under a British flag, on a creaking wooden vessel called the Endeavour. And with them would come a different kind of gaze, not just one of exploration, but of possession. The year was 1770. somewhere along the southeastern coast of a continent still unnamed on European lips. The HMS Endeavour drifted slowly into a sheltered bay. It was April, and the weather had turned mild. A soft mist clinging to the shore where banks of unfamiliar flowers bloomed in purples and yellows. Joseph Banks, the naturalist aboard the ship, stepped ashore with unmasked excitement, noting in his journal the lush vegetation and the songs of birds unknown to science. This was Botany Bay, a name that would come to carry weight and consequence, far beyond its peaceful first impression. Captain James Cook, standing nearby, was focused on something else entirely. With the measured precision of a seasoned navigator, he began charting the shoreline, mapping in fine detail what no European had before. The coastline curved like a sleeping dragon, long and jagged, with inlets and cliffs, dense bushland, and no obvious signs, at least to European eyes, of permanent settlement. But of course, the land was not empty. The Greygull people had lived in that region for countless generations. They watched the arrival of the strange vessel with caution. As the crew disembarked, there was no grand welcome, only wary observation. What happened next was recorded in clipped, neutral tones by Cook, who described how a small group of men approached the indigenous people, holding up trinkets and offers of peace. But the Greygull warriors stood firm, holding their ground with spears in hand. According to Cook's own account, when these gestures of diplomacy failed, a musket was fired. One of the Greygull was injured. The encounter ended not with understanding, but with a wound and silence. It's a moment often glossed over in classroom retellings, but it set the tone for what would follow. To the British, this land was a blank canvas. To the Greygull and hundreds of other Aboriginal nations, it was a rich and living world. Already full, already spoken for. Cook's journey up the coast lasted months. From Botany Bay, he followed the eastern shoreline, noting its many coves and capes, naming them as he went. Some names still survive. Cape Tribulation, for instance, so called after the Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef and nearly sank. Others, like Point Hicks, mark the first place on the mainland seen by Cook's crew at dawn, through heavy mist. They were laying down European names on ancient lands that already had names and stories, ones that stretched back 60,000 years. Joseph Banks, meanwhile, was writing with the enthusiasm of a man who saw a new world through the eyes of empire. He reported on fertile soils, vast grasslands, and a climate that seemed, in parts, ideal for agriculture. Though later settlers would find the land more stubborn than he described, its fertility patchy, its rhythms unfamiliar, his glowing reports helped solidify the idea that this place could support a colony. And timing was everything. Britain had recently lost its American colonies, severing one of its major outlets for penal transportation. Thousands of convicts, many guilty of minor crimes, were now sitting idle in overcrowded prisons and rotting hulks anchored in the Thames. A new destination was needed, and fast. Cook's logs, Banks's descriptions, and a growing geopolitical anxiety about French expansion made the east coast of New Holland look suddenly irresistible. Still, there was a legal hurdle to overcome. Under international law, land could only be claimed if it was uninhabited, or if its inhabitants were deemed incapable of possessing sovereignty. And so, the British invoked a doctrine known as terra nullius, land belonging to no one. It's a term with cold precision, and it would cast a long shadow. The British did not recognize Aboriginal systems of law, governance, or land management. They ignored the clear evidence of long-term habitation, fish traps, cultivated yam fields, intricate songlines that mapped the terrain. Instead, they declared the land unowned and took it. Quietly, on Possession Island in August of 1770, Cook raised the Union Jack and claimed the entire eastern coast of the continent for the British Crown. There was no ceremony, no dialogue with the people who lived there. Just a flag, a log entry, and the beginning of something irreversible. In the years that followed, Cook's legacy became mythologized. He was painted in British memory as a brilliant navigator, a symbol of exploration and courage. And in many ways, he was all of those things. But the narratives often left out the complexity, the violence at Botany Bay, the failure to understand or respect indigenous sovereignty, the seeds of dispossession sown in that quiet act of claiming. Still, It's worth remembering that Cook himself was not the architect of colonization. He was a surveyor, a captain following orders, and his instructions explicitly told him to seek the consent of indigenous peoples where possible. Whether he tried hard enough or understood what he was seeing is another question altogether. Back in Britain, his charts were received with quiet awe. The imagined southern continent was no longer a mystery. It had been sketched and named and measured. New South Wales, Cook called it, a name drawn from the familiar cliffs of the Welsh coast. In the cold offices of the Admiralty and Whitehall, plans were already beginning to form. The land seemed ripe for the taking, and in just 18 years, the first fleet would arrive at the very shores Cook had mapped. Sometimes I wonder what it would have felt like, standing on that ship, looking out over a coastline that had been home to thousands of generations. Would I have seen emptiness, or would I have noticed the smoke from campfires, the worn footpaths through the brush, the subtle signs of human care woven into the land itself? Cook, for all his skills, may have lacked the language, or perhaps the patience, to understand what he was really seeing. And so the map was drawn, not in blood, not yet, but with the quiet confidence of empire. Names were given, claims were made, and the wheels of history turned. They would return, of course, not explorers this time, but settlers, soldiers, and convicts. What began as ink on parchment would soon become buildings, farms, fences, and prisons. But for now, the land remained unchanged. The sun still rose over the eucalyptus trees, and the waves lapped gently against the beaches of Botany Bay. But everything was about to change. The ships groaned and creaked as they entered the mouth of Botany Bay, sails catching the hot January wind. It was 1788, and after months of open sea, harsh storms, and the ever-present stench of confinement, the first fleet had arrived. 11 ships, over 1,400 souls, convicts, soldiers, marines, and a few civilians, drifted toward a continent that few of them had imagined with any clarity. What awaited them was not the fertile paradise described in Joseph Banks's reports, but an unfamiliar coastline, dry scrubland, and the wary eyes of the Eora people watching from the shore. Governor Arthur Phillip was in command, tasked with establishing a penal colony on behalf of the British Crown. He quickly found Botany Bay unsuitable, too shallow, poor soil, no reliable freshwater, and within days moved the fleet north to a narrow cove with a freshwater stream. They named it Sydney Cove. That name, of course, would become the anchor point of a new nation. But in those early days, it was nothing more than tents in the sand, surrounded by bushland and uncertainty. The land did not give easily. The first months were a desperate struggle. Crops failed in the unfamiliar climate. Tools rusted in the salty air. Rations dwindled faster than expected. Hunger turned quickly into starvation, and starvation into disease. "We have now been 2 years in the country," wrote Marine Officer Watkin Tench. "Until within the last 6 months, we had not had a single article of fresh provisions from the country." The settlers had neither the skills nor the resources to adapt to a continent that operated on entirely different rhythms from England. Meanwhile, the Eora people, the traditional custodians of the land around Sydney Cove, were observing. At first, there were cautious interactions. Some bartered fish for cloth or trinkets. Others watched from a distance, unsure what to make of these pale strangers who brought animals that tore up the ground and felled trees without ceremony. Governor Phillip, to his credit, tried to foster peaceful relations. He even ordered that no retaliation be made if Aboriginal people attacked, believing diplomacy would prevail. But fear and misunderstanding ran deep. When Phillip ordered the capture of an Aboriginal man in order to learn the local language and customs, the result was a complex and controversial relationship. That man was Bennelong. Taken against his will, Bennelong was held at Government House, taught English words, dressed in European clothes. He escaped after a few months, but later returned willingly, forming a strange and fragile bond with Phillip. The governor saw in Bennelong a potential bridge between cultures. He dined at the governor's table, travelled to England, even met King George III. But when he returned to his homeland years later, the world he had left behind had changed. His people saw him differently. and the settlers now saw him as someone no longer fully either. Then there was Pemulwuy, a warrior of the Bidjigal clan. He would not seek diplomacy, but resistance. In 1790, after a fellow clansman was killed by settlers, Pemulwuy speared a colonial gamekeeper, the beginning of years of organized guerrilla warfare against the encroaching British. He led raids, burned crops, and eluded capture time and again. To the settlers, he was a dangerous rebel. To his people, a hero defending country and law. Even when he was shot and captured in 1797, he managed to escape, shackled in irons, yet gone by morning. Life in the fledgling colony remained precarious. Convicts lived under brutal discipline. Lashings were common, sometimes hundreds of lashes for theft or defiance. Female convicts, far fewer in number, often found themselves trapped in desperate arrangements, treated as property, traded for rum or favours. Letters and diaries from the time speak of cruelty, but also of moments of strange humanity. Guards looking the other way, friendships formed in unlikely places, and the stubborn determination to survive. Food shortages were a constant threat. The colony relied on supply ships from Britain and India, and if one were delayed or lost, famine followed. In 1790, the Second Fleet arrived, not with relief, but disaster. Of the over 1,000 convicts on board, hundreds were already dead or dying from disease and mistreatment. The private contractors hired to transport them had prioritized profit, and the result was a floating graveyard. Yet despite it all, the colony began to take root. The soil, though challenging, slowly yielded to European crops. Livestock began to breed. Children were born who had never seen Britain. Roads were built, bricks laid, and government structures slowly formed. By the end of the 1790s, Sydney was no longer a campsite but a town. But as the colony grew, so too did its hunger for land. Settlers pushed inland, clearing trees, building fences, claiming streams. The concept of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, had been used to justify British possession. But the reality was stark. This was stolen land, and the people to whom it belonged were being pushed aside, displaced, and, increasingly, attacked. The first land grants were given not to Aboriginal peoples, but to officers and free settlers. Convicts who earned their freedom might receive small plots, but the best land always went to those with power. These early grants laid the foundation for a system of inequality that would stretch far into the future. And yet, in the middle of this uneasy expansion, moments of strange duality persisted. There were instances, rare but real, of settlers who learned local languages, who lived among Aboriginal families, who saw the land not just as a resource, but a living being. We sometimes forget these stories, lost in the larger narrative of conquest, but they remind us that history is never just black and white. Arthur Phillip left the colony in 1792, worn down by illness and the enormity of the task he had been given. He had tried to hold together a vision of order in a world that resisted control at every turn. In his absence, others would take over, and the colony would change rapidly, growing beyond Sydney Cove, becoming bolder, harsher, more ambitious. The line between survival and empire would blur. As I think about those early years, I can't help but imagine what it must have sounded like at night. The clink of irons, the crackle of fire, the distant songs of the era people, in the dark bush beyond the settlement. Two worlds existing side by side, trying to understand each other, or destroy each other. That tension never really left the Australian story. It just changed shape. And as we move forward through the decades, that shape will become clearer. The colony will stretch its limbs, claiming hills and rivers in all directions. But with each step outward, it will stir more conflict and more resistance. The early settlements, as fragile as they were, didn't expand without consequence. As the colony's footprint grew, so too did the conflicts. Silent at first, then louder, sharper, more desperate. What began with uneasy glances and misunderstood gestures soon escalated into full-fledged violence, a slow, relentless war that sprawled across generations and landscapes. These were the Australian Frontier Wars, a chapter long kept quiet but written deeply into the soil. There was no single declaration of war, no grand proclamations or formal treaties broken. Instead, it unfolded in flashes, skirmishes in the bush, poisoned flour handed out in trust, fires at night where crops once stood. For Aboriginal people, the arrival of the settlers marked not just an invasion of territory, but of life itself, of sacred ground, of totem lines, of law and kinship. Every fence driven into the earth was a wound. Every settler's hut, a signal that something was being taken and wouldn't be returned. Some resisted with quiet acts, taking back tools, setting fire to encroaching outposts, guiding livestock into the wilderness. Others, like Pemulwuy in the early years around Sydney, fought openly. But as the colonies pushed outward, especially into fertile lands of New South Wales, Queensland, and Tasmania, resistance evolved into organised and persistent struggle. One of the most haunting examples unfolded in Tasmania. It was known then as Van Diemen's Land. By the 1820s, settlers there were expanding sheep grazing into the island's central highlands, displacing the Palawa peoples who had lived there for millennia. The violence was brutal and one-sided. Aboriginal people fought back with guerrilla tactics, small bands raiding outstations, reclaiming stolen tools, attacking isolated farms. In response, the colonial authorities declared martial law in 1828, giving settlers a license to kill under the guise of protection. This period became known as the Black War. The term doesn't quite capture the scale of it. By the early 1830s, the Aboriginal population of Tasmania had been reduced from an estimated 7,000 at the time of European arrival to just a few hundred. Some were killed outright. Others died of introduced diseases, starvation, or despair. There are accounts of entire family groups being wiped out in a single night. One colonial observer, George Augustus Robinson, who would later oversee the so-called reconciliation efforts, kept a journal filled with unsettling detail, recording massacres, kidnappings, and the eerie silence that followed them. But resistance wasn't confined to Tasmania. On the mainland, the conflict stretched like a slow-moving tide, always advancing, always pushing people further from their country. In New South Wales, Wiradjuri leader Windradine emerged in the 1820s as a powerful figure of defiance. Known for his imposing presence and deep knowledge of the land, Windradine led a campaign of resistance around the Bathurst region. He was eventually captured, pardoned, and famously attended a colonial feast in 1824 with peace written on his hat, a moment that seemed to mark a turning point. But it didn't last. The pressures never ceased. In Western Australia, Yagan, a Noongar warrior, led a fierce defense of his people's territory around the Swan River. His story, like so many others, ended violently. He was killed in 1833, his head severed and sent to England for study, a grotesque echo of how the colonial project sought to dominate not only the living, but the dead. Then came Queensland, a land of fierce resistance and some of the most violent repression. By the mid-19th century, settlers were pushing north into rich grazing lands, often accompanied by a force known as the Native Police. This was a strange and deeply troubling institution. Aboriginal men recruited, often forcibly, to police and kill other Aboriginal groups under white officers' command. It was a divide and conquer strategy that caused generational trauma and internal division. The Native Police were infamous for their punitive raids. Survivors described entire camps being wiped out, children taken or killed, women abused. Official records were often vague, casualties listed as dispersed, a term that concealed what had really happened. In 1861, journalist Charles Eden travelled through northern Queensland and wrote in his diary, "There is hardly a settler here who has not been involved in some altercation with the blacks. Most speak of shooting them, as one might speak of shooting wallabies." It's chilling how ordinary it was made to seem. Other names echo through this history. Jandamara in the Kimberley, who combined traditional law with guerrilla warfare in the 1990s, leading police on a years-long manhunt. His knowledge of cave systems and country made him nearly untouchable for a time. Some thought him invincible, even supernatural. He was eventually betrayed by someone close and shot, but his story remains one of the most remarkable in the long fight for survival. This was not a single war. It was thousands of small wars, flaring and fading across decades. It took place on open plains and rocky escarpments, in rainforests and deserts. The scale is staggering. Historians now estimate that over 100,000 Aboriginal people died in these conflicts, alongside roughly 2,500 settlers. The imbalance was never just in numbers, but in power. The rifles, the horses, the legal systems designed to protect one group while condemning another. What strikes me, reading through these accounts, is how long it took for this to be acknowledged. For much of Australia's official history, the frontier wars were brushed aside, seen as unfortunate side notes, not central chapters. Schoolbooks talked of settlement, not invasion. Statues honored explorers, not the defenders of country. Even today, the recognition of this history remains uneven, politicized, often denied. But listen closely, and the land remembers. There are sites still known by locals for what happened there, even if they don't say it aloud. Massacre sites with no markers, rivers that ran red once, trees that witnessed things no one speaks of. And yet, through all of it, the culture endured. Despite the attempts at erasure, the songs, the languages, the kinship lines, they continued. The very act of survival became a form of resistance. Children learned stories whispered under stars, far from where their ancestors had been. And now, those stories are being told again, not in anger alone, but in memory, in pride, and in the quiet power of truth. Because this wasn't just a war of bodies, it was a war of worldviews, a clash between a culture that sought to divide, conquer, and measure the land, and cultures that had walked it in harmony for thousands of generations. It's not about rewriting history, it's about completing it, filling in the spaces that were left blank on purpose. So much happened in those shadows between maps and memories. But as the frontier slowly faded and new colonies took shape, a different kind of expansion began, one driven not by musket or marching feet, but by wool, by rails, by cities growing inland like vines reaching for water. The wars did not end cleanly. They simply gave way to something quieter, but just as relentless. And the story of Australia continued. The land had been carved, claimed, and fought over. By the early 1800s, the colony that began at Sydney Cove had already started to sprawl outward, reaching over mountains and into interior plains, with a hunger that never seemed to pause. And now, the story moves into a new kind of conquest, one less about chains and punishment, and more about wool, wealth, and relentless expansion. It began with sheep. By the 1820s, settlers had realized that Australia's dry grasslands, so alien and rough to British eyes at first, were surprisingly suited to pastoralism. Merino sheep, brought from Cape Colony in South Africa, flourished in the Australian climate. Their fine wool became a booming commodity, especially with the rising demand in Britain. As historian Judith Wright once wrote, the sheep became the real colonists. They spread across the land without boundaries, without fear. And behind the sheep came the squatters. These were often younger sons of British families, those who wouldn't inherit property back home, or ex-convicts who had earned their freedom. They occupied vast tracts of land, often illegally at first, setting up rudimentary homesteads, and letting their herds graze beyond officially sanctioned limits. Over time, this form of occupation gained tacit approval from colonial authorities, particularly as wool exports began driving the colonial economy. By the 1830s, squatters were no longer just trespassers. The government legitimized their claims through cheap leases under laws like the Squatting Acts. Some came to control immense runs, with hundreds of thousands of acres under their domain. These men, wealthy, self-made, and politically influential, became known as the squattocracy. They were rarely sentimental. The land, to them, was opportunity, not sacred. They enclosed it, altered it, fenced it off, and where their flocks moved, Aboriginal peoples were pushed further and further out, or else violently removed. It's here the narrative darkens again. In many cases, Settlers and squatters entered into open conflict with indigenous communities, resisting the destruction of their food sources, their sacred sites, their way of life. One settler wrote in 1836, "They came at night with spears, for we had built over their waterhole. We answered with guns." These weren't isolated moments. Across the continent, as wool boomed and pastures spread, the frontier bled. Alongside this wave of occupation came the push to establish new colonies. Van Diemen's Land, later renamed Tasmania, had developed early on as a separate penal colony, but by the 1830s and 40s, other regions began asserting their distinct identities. Western Australia was founded in 1829 as the Swan River Colony. Unlike New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land, it was originally intended for free settlers. Yet the land was harsh, labour was scarce, and the economy lagged. Eventually, even they requested convict labour to support development. South Australia, by contrast, was established in 1836 with a bold experiment, a colony without convicts. Based on the theories of Edward Gibbon Wakefield, it was supposed to demonstrate a more moral, planned approach to colonization. Settlers were selected for their skills and character. Land was sold rather than granted, and there was an emphasis on religious freedom and civil order. Still, the reality quickly proved more complex. Within a few decades, South Australia faced its own frontier conflicts and moral contradictions. Victoria began as part of New South Wales, but the economic boom brought by the Port Phillip district's wool trade and, later, gold, gave it a distinctive character. In 1851, it was declared a separate colony, with Melbourne at its heart. That same year, Queensland too would start to drift toward its own colonial identity, though it wouldn't officially separate until 1859. Each of these new colonies wasn't just a political division. They reflected differences in economy, class structure, immigration policy, and social ambition. Yet they shared the same underlying engine, land, and the desire to extract as much from it as possible. Explorers also played their part, though not all of them survived the harsh conditions. The ill-fated expedition of Burke and Wills in 1860 is one such haunting example. They set out from Melbourne with the grand ambition of crossing the continent from south to north. Lavishly equipped, the expedition became mired in heat, miscommunication, and dwindling supplies. They reached the Gulf of Carpentaria, but not the open sea, and on the return journey, most of the party perished. Charles Grey died first. Burke and Wills followed soon after. Only one man, John King, survived, aided by the local Yandrawanda people. It's a tale often told in classrooms, but rarely with proper weight given to the fact that Aboriginal Australians had lived in the regions they passed through for tens of thousands of years, surviving droughts, floods, and scarcity with ingenuity. The idea of discovery was always misleading. It was less about discovering new land, and more about European attempts to impose new names, new borders, and new systems on a continent that had already been known and cared for. As settlements pushed inland, towns began to rise from the dust. Some started as tiny depots or cattle stations, and grew into hubs of trade. Telegraph lines were strung between them, and railways began to appear, iron stitching together distant patches of the frontier. The Overland Telegraph Line, completed in 1872, connected Adelaide to Darwin and ultimately to London via submarine cable. Suddenly, messages could cross the planet in hours instead of weeks. Technology shrank the world, even as settlers expanded their dominion over vast landscapes. But this growth had a cost that is difficult to measure in statistics alone. Displacement didn't always come with open violence. Sometimes it arrived slowly, through fencing off waterholes, introducing livestock that trampled sacred grounds, or banning indigenous burning practices that had shaped ecosystems for millennia. In many areas, Aboriginal people were driven into missions or fringe camps. Others continued to resist, quietly, defiantly, maintaining language, stories, ceremony, even as official records labelled them as extinct tribes. There's an eerie quiet in that kind of erasure, a silence imposed, not chosen. Still, Australia in the mid to late 1800s was not a settled picture. It was a place humming with motion, of sheep being driven across dry plains, of rail cars rattling into new towns, of letters arriving from England with news months out of date, of school bells ringing in little weatherboard buildings. of fires burning on country long before any British foot arrived. The wool kept flowing to Britain. The squatters grew richer, and the colonies began to imagine themselves as more than outposts. They were, in their minds, becoming societies in their own right. Not yet a nation, but something was beginning to stir in that direction. The arrival of gold, soon after, would ignite more than just the economy. It would fan social fires, draw in thousands from across the globe, and reshape the social fabric in ways no one could quite foresee. The gold rushes of the 1850s did more than just fill pockets. They reshaped the very fabric of colonial Australia, weaving threads of hope, hardship, and upheaval across a land still very much in formation. When gold was first discovered in New South Wales, at Ophir in 1851, and shortly after in Victoria at Ballarat and Bendigo, it set off a rush of people, dreams, and change that would ripple through every corner of the emerging society. Imagine the sudden explosion of boomtowns overnight, tent cities sprouting where only scrub and gum trees had stood, dusty streets filled with a constant hum of activity, the sharp clink of picks striking rock, and the clatter of horse-drawn carts laden with supplies. Thousands poured in, some with barely a coin to their name, driven by the hope of striking it rich, others by the promise of a new life far from the strict confines of Britain's class system. Among these hopeful seekers were not just British settlers, but a remarkable diversity of people: Irish, Germans, Americans, and, notably, a large influx of Chinese migrants who came by the tens of thousands. Their arrival introduced new cultural textures to the colonies, but also tensions that would shape much of the social landscape. The goldfields were places of opportunity and violence, camaraderie and conflict, wealth and grinding poverty. Life on the goldfields was brutal and raw. Water was scarce in many locations, food expensive, and shelter often little more than hastily assembled canvas or bark. Yet the social environment was unlike anything back home. The usual hierarchies were blurred. Miners might work side by side, regardless of origin or previous status. But beneath that surface lay simmering resentments, especially against the Chinese, who were often scapegoated for everything from economic competition to cultural misunderstandings. These tensions erupted into violence and exclusion. Chinese miners were targeted with hostile laws, poll taxes designed to discourage their presence, and restrictions on where they could mine. Despite this, many Chinese communities thrived, setting up market gardens, shops, and temples that became vibrant centers of culture in the goldfields. Their resilience under such pressure remains a testament to human endurance amid adversity. One of the defining moments of this era was the Eureka Stockade, a rebellion at Ballarat in 1854. It was sparked by frustrations with mining licenses and the heavy-handed policing that enforced them. Miners banded together, erecting a crude wooden barricade in defiance of the colonial authorities. The battle itself was brief and bloody. Troopers stormed the stockade, killing at least 22 miners and wounding many more. But the impact was profound. The event is often remembered as the birthplace of Australian democracy, a moment when ordinary people stood up for their rights, demanding fair treatment and representation. The leaders of the uprising, like Peter Lalo, would go on to play significant roles in the colony's political evolution, translating the miners' grievances into reforms. The license system was abolished, and miners gained the right to vote. It was a turning point that reflected a growing sense of agency among settlers and shaped the colony's political culture. But alongside these stories of struggle and triumph, the gold rushes also fed the darker sides of human nature. Lawlessness and bushranging became commonplace. Figures like Ned Kelly have since been mythologized, his iron helmet and armor a symbol of rebellion against a system seen as unjust. Yet Kelly's life was complex, tangled with both outlawry and a deep mistrust of authorities who often treated Irish settlers harshly. His story captures the contradictions of the gold rush era, the lure of freedom, the thirst for justice, and the harsh realities of frontier law. Economically, the gold rushes transformed the colonies. Melbourne rapidly became one of the richest cities in the world by the late 1850s, with wealth flooding in to fund grand buildings, railways, and cultural institutions. This sudden prosperity helped move the colonies from penal outposts to thriving settlements with ambitions of self-government and eventual federation. The influx of wealth and people created pressure to expand infrastructure, improve governance, and accommodate a rapidly changing population. Yet, beneath the excitement, this surge of settlement intensified the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples. As miners and settlers pushed into new areas, indigenous communities were displaced, their sacred lands disrupted, and conflicts escalated. The goldfields were often on territories held for millennia by Aboriginal peoples, and the arrival of thousands of miners brought violence, disease, and environmental destruction. The clash between the dream of wealth and the reality of colonization left deep scars, often ignored in the grand narratives of prosperity. It's worth pausing to consider how this period laid early groundwork for a national identity. The gold rush brought together a mosaic of cultures, but also fostered a sense of being Australian, a break from purely British identity. The camaraderie among miners, the shared hardships, and the fight for rights planted seeds of what would become a distinct Australian character. Resourceful, independent, and often skeptical of authority. These qualities, forged in the fires of the goldfields, would echo in the nation's story, long after the last nuggets were pulled from the rivers. This era also introduced enduring social and racial tensions that would shape policy and society for decades. The hostility towards Chinese migrants foreshadowed the White Australia policy, while the exclusion and marginalisation of Indigenous peoples hardened. The promise of the gold rush was unevenly shared, reminding us that history is rarely simple. Listening to letters and diaries from miners, you get a sense of their restless hope and frustration. One miner wrote in 1853, "We came seeking fortune, but find only dust and struggle. Yet still, we dream." Another noted the strange mix of camaraderie and suspicion that defined the camps, where strangers from across the world could be friends one day and rivals the next. The gold rush era, then, is not just a story of shiny riches, but one of profound transformation. It cracked open Australia to the world, ushered in waves of migration, and forced colonial society to confront new challenges. It was a time of dreams and realities intertwined, a complex chapter in the making of a nation. The home of colonial life in 19th century Australia was a delicate weave of contrasts. Between harsh survival and fleeting comforts, between inherited British traditions and the forging of something uniquely Australian. This was a world still raw from its penal past, yet pulsing with new hopes, ambitions, and restless energy. At the base of the social ladder were the convicts, or bond, as they were often called, who had arrived in chains, but now found themselves released, or serving out sentences, in a land that was both prison and promise. For many, life after conviction was an uneasy balancing act. Some managed to carve out modest livelihoods, becoming small farmers, tradespeople, or labourers. Others remained trapped in the shadow of their pasts, facing suspicion and discrimination from free settlers. The term ticket of leave signified a conditional freedom, a fragile piece of paper that allowed ex-convicts to work, but not to fully shed the stigma of their origins. Yet, these individuals contributed enormously to the colony's growth, quietly stitching themselves into its fabric. Above them rose the free settlers, many of whom came driven by opportunity or necessity, escaping economic hardship or social constraints in Britain and Ireland. They brought with them dreams of owning land, building homes, and raising families far from the rigid class structures of the old world. Their stories were often recorded in letters, diaries, and newspapers, giving us a window into their daily lives. The harsh winters, the struggles to cultivate unfamiliar soil, the celebrations that punctuated their relentless work. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of colonial hardships, managing households with scant resources, enduring childbirth in crude conditions, and often acting as the emotional glue holding communities together. Then there were the squatters, the wealthy landholders who had pushed beyond official boundaries, occupying vast tracts of land to raise sheep for wool, the colony's lifeblood export. Their estates became sprawling symbols of status, dotted with grand homesteads that mimicked the styles of England's countryside manors. This elite class wielded considerable political influence, shaping laws and policies to protect their interests. But their wealth came at a cost, further dispossession and displacement of Aboriginal peoples, whose connection to the land was ignored or dismissed in the rush for profit and progress. The emergent middle class, including merchants, professionals, and skilled artisans, found their place somewhere between these worlds, fostering civic institutions that would shape Australia's cultural landscape. Churches were among the first formal structures built, serving not only spiritual needs, but also as centers of social life and moral guidance. Education slowly expanded, often with a religious underpinning, aiming to instill British values and social order in the young. Yet, it also became a tool for shaping a distinct colonial identity, one that began to diverge subtly from the old country, reflecting the realities of life in the Antipodes. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne swelled with this growth, their streets echoing with the sounds of horse-drawn carts, clinking tools, and lively marketplaces. By the mid-19th century, Melbourne was famously called Marvellous Melbourne, a city of booming fortunes and bustling activity, its skyline punctuated by elegant public buildings, theatres, and universities. The arrival of railways transformed not only transport but social connectivity. Towns once isolated became linked by iron threads, knitting the continent closer together. This physical expansion mirrored the social evolution underway. New ideas, fashions, and debates flowed alongside goods and passengers. Yet beneath this veneer of progress lay contradictions that shaped colonial society in subtle, often troubling ways. The lingering influence of Victorian-era morality prescribed strict roles and behaviours, particularly for women, whose opportunities remained limited and whose voices were often confined to the domestic sphere. At the same time, laws and social norms enforced a rigid racial hierarchy. Free settlers were seen as superior to convicts, who were in turn deemed superior to indigenous peoples and non-European immigrants. This stratification was often justified through ideas of civilization and race that echoed the scientific and cultural biases of the era. Religion played a powerful role in everyday life, not only as a source of comfort and community, but also as a force shaping public policy and social attitudes. The Anglican Church was dominant, but Catholicism grew rapidly with the influx of Irish settlers, sometimes intensifying sectarian tensions. Missionaries sought to convert Aboriginal people, often with mixed motives and outcomes, while temperance movements and moral reform campaigns aimed to curb perceived social ills. Newspapers and pamphlets thrived as the colony's appetite for news, debate, and culture grew, fueling a lively public sphere that laid the groundwork for later political developments. In art and literature, the seeds of a uniquely Australian voice began to take root, even if the colonial scene was still heavily influenced by British models. Early painters captured sweeping landscapes, the rugged beauty of the bush, and scenes of settlement life, often emphasizing the drama of frontier encounters and the harshness of the environment. Poets and writers, many of whom were immigrants or children of settlers, started to explore themes of identity, belonging, and the complex relationship with the land. Their works hinted at the tensions and hopes brewing beneath colonial society's surface, a sense of something new emerging from old traditions. One cannot overlook the role of the press in shaping the colony's consciousness. Papers such as the Sydney Gazette and the Argus became vital forums for information and opinion, chronicling everything from gold rush excitement to political debates and social reform campaigns. Editorials reflected the aspirations and anxieties of a growing population, from concerns about labour rights and land ownership to fears of lawlessness and moral decay. Letters to the editor reveal ordinary voices grappling with the realities of colonial life, offering insights into how people understood their place in this unfolding story. Education slowly expanded beyond its early missionary roots. By the late 19th century, public schools began to appear, often funded by local communities or governments eager to instill literacy and civic values. This spread of education was a crucial step in building a society capable of self-governance and innovation. Still, these schools rarely acknowledged Indigenous knowledge or histories, reflecting the broader exclusion of Aboriginal peoples from the colonial narrative. Amidst all these threads, it's striking to consider the persistence of British cultural ties. Many colonists felt a strong attachment to the monarchy, British institutions, and traditions, even as they adapted to life on a distant continent. This loyalty influenced everything from legal systems to social customs, and even fashion, with the prevailing styles of London's Victorian era filtering slowly into Australian towns and homes. Yet, there was also a growing sense of difference, a quiet stirring that would eventually push toward a distinct Australian identity. It's worth pausing here to reflect on some personal voices from the time. In a letter dated 1863, a settler named Elizabeth MacArthur wrote about life on her family's property in New South Wales. The days are long and often lonely, but there is a fierce beauty in this land that draws you deeper with each passing season. We are still strangers here, in many ways, yet the soil beneath our feet speaks of stories far older than our own. Her words capture that tension between belonging and alienation, so common among settlers. Meanwhile, the ex-convict turned entrepreneur, Francis Greenway, left a different mark. As an architect, he shaped the built environment of early Sydney, designing churches, public buildings, and homes that blended elegance with practicality. His life story, from convict to respected professional, mirrors the complex social mobility possible in the colony, even amid prejudice. Throughout these decades, the rhythms of colonial life were shaped by cycles of hardship and celebration, isolation and community. The harshness of the environment demanded resilience, while the growing towns and cities offered spaces for culture, learning, and hope. People gathered in churches, schools, theatres, and pubs, finding ways to connect despite class divides and past hardships. All these elements, social structures, cultural development, ties to Britain, and the evolving relationship with the land and its peoples, converged to create a colonial society that was at once familiar and new. It was a society in flux, carrying the weight of its penal origins and the promise of a future still unwritten. As we consider this, it becomes clear that the 19th century was not just a time of external expansion across Australia's vast landscapes, but an internal journey toward defining what it meant to live here, who belonged, and who was left outside the circle. The echoes of these choices still resonate, reminding us that history is not only about events, but the lives and voices that wove them together. There was a quiet momentum gathering across the vast, rugged land in the closing decades of the 19th century. The separate colonies, each with its own government, laws and interests, were beginning to feel the pull of something greater than their individual parts. It was an unspoken, almost organic urge toward unity, a shared vision slowly taking shape among settlers, politicians and thinkers alike. The Australian continent, vast and wild, was on the cusp of becoming a nation, but this journey was far from simple or inevitable. Trade and defence concerns made cooperation necessary. Railways and telegraphs stitched colonies closer together, and debates about tariffs and border customs became louder, more urgent. The economic rivalry that once fueled suspicion was starting to give way to a practical understanding. Working together could benefit everyone. It was during this time that ideas about Australian identity began to crystallise, shaped by both shared experience and a longing to distinguish themselves from the old world. You might imagine that this identity sprang suddenly like a spark in the dark, but it was slower, softer, woven through the daily lives of people who laboured on farms, in factories, and across goldfields. It was heard in the cheers echoing from makeshift ovals, where Australian rules football was gaining ground. Born in the 1850s as a rough and tumble sport, inspired by Indigenous games and British football codes, it became a cultural touchstone, something uniquely Australian. Sporting heroes were early symbols of a rugged, independent spirit, celebrated in pubs and community halls alike. Alongside the rise of sport, the arts were quietly beginning to nurture a national consciousness. Paintings by artists like Tom Roberts and Frederick McCubbin captured scenes of the bush and pioneer life, landscapes that were not just backdrops, but characters in their own right. Poems by Banjo Paterson and Henry Lawson began to shape a mythology of the Australian outback, the hard-working battler, the larrikin with a wry smile. These voices helped forge a shared story, a narrative distinct from British colonial roots, yet still deeply tied to the land and its trials. Politically, Henry Parkes, often called the father of federation, played a pivotal role. His Tenterfield oration in 1889 was a call to arms, not for violence, but for unity. Standing in a small town in New South Wales, Parkes urged the colonies to put aside their differences and form a federal government, warning that without cooperation, Australia risked remaining a series of isolated, vulnerable states. His words echoed beyond that gathering, sparking conferences and discussions that would slowly lead to the drafting of a constitution. These intercolonial conferences were complex, involving heated debates over the balance of power between a central government and the individual colonies. Issues like immigration, customs, defence, and infrastructure demanded consensus, but fears about losing autonomy ran deep. Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania all had their own interests and priorities, often competing rather than collaborating. Yet, with each meeting, the vision of a federated Australia became less a distant dream and more a practical goal. Among ordinary people, this growing nationalism blended pride in their pioneering past with cautious optimism for the future. Letters and newspapers from the time reveal a people increasingly aware that they were shaping something new. Some spoke of Australia as a young nation destined to stand on equal footing with the great powers. Others worried about what unification might mean for their local traditions and ways of life. But almost everyone sensed that the old colonial ties to Britain, while respected, were no longer the sole defining feature of their identity. It's fascinating to consider how much of this transformation was quietly brewing beneath the surface. For example, the early stirrings of what would become the Anzac legend, though it would only fully take shape decades later, can be traced to this era's emerging ideas of mateship, courage, and resilience. These values were spoken of in pubs and community gatherings, shaping how Australians saw themselves and their place in the world. The sense of shared destiny was palpable, even if its exact shape was still unfolding. Meanwhile, the practical realities of governance required drafting documents that could hold together this fragile union. The early drafts of the Australian Constitution, worked on through the 1890s, sought to balance the desire for a strong federal government with protections for states' rights. It was a delicate negotiation that involved lawyers, politicians, and thinkers wrestling with legal frameworks that would last for centuries. There were moments of tension and compromise, as well as concerns about how the new government would handle immigration, Indigenous affairs, and economic regulation. One of the less obvious but equally important threads was the role of the media. Newspapers and pamphlets played a significant role in spreading federalist ideas and encouraging public debate. Editorials praised the notion of federation as a way to strengthen the continent's voice on the global stage, while others warned against losing local control. For many Australians, these pages were where the abstract idea of nationhood took on flesh and substance. It's worth noting, too, that this growing sense of nationhood coexisted with underlying contradictions and tensions. The celebration of mateship and egalitarianism often masked the exclusion of many groups from the political and social mainstream. The federation movement was driven largely by white settlers, with little consideration for Indigenous peoples or non-European immigrants. Yet, in these debates, seeds were planted that would later provoke crucial questions about justice, inclusion, and the meaning of belonging in Australia. As the 19th century waned, public events increasingly reflected this growing pride. Exhibitions showcased Australian products and innovations. Celebrations marked key anniversaries of settlement and exploration. Cultural festivals brought communities together to reflect on their shared history. The sense that Australia was on the verge of something new was not just political, it was cultural and emotional. You could feel it in the conversations, in the schools teaching history from a local perspective, and in the growing body of Australian literature and art. One can imagine how the people of this era, farmers, miners, shopkeepers, women organising schools and charities, might have discussed these ideas over evening fires or at local town halls. The desire to belong to a nation that could protect their interests, celebrate their achievements, and define their own future must have been both exhilarating and daunting. There was a cautious hopefulness in the air, tempered by the knowledge that the path ahead would not be without difficulty. It's this delicate, complex moment that leads us naturally to the final chapter of Australia's 19th century journey, the moment when federation becomes reality. But before we arrive there, it is important to hold in mind the diverse voices and forces that shaped this long process. The politicians crafting the Constitution, the artists and poets forging identity, the communities navigating change, and the quiet movements beneath it all. They remind us that nation building is not just about laws and speeches, but about the stories people tell themselves late at night, the shared hopes that take root in everyday life. With the dawn of the 20th century just ahead, Australia stood ready to step into a new chapter. Yet, the nation it would become was already marked by contradictions between progress and exclusion, celebration and erasure. These tensions would shape the early decades of federation and echo throughout the century. The story of Australia, as always, is one of complexity, resilience, and ongoing discovery. The close of the 19th century in Australia is a moment that feels both triumphant and uneasy, a time when a new nation was being born amid deep contradictions and shadows that would shape its future for decades to come. As the colonies gathered momentum toward federation in 1901, the stories woven into that process reveal much about who was included in the dream of Australia, and perhaps more quietly, who was left out. It's easy to think of federation as a neat, orderly coming together, a patriotic moment of unity. Yet beneath the celebrations and constitutional debates, there was a hard edge. The exclusion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from the national story was not a simple oversight. It was a deliberate political choice. The Australian Constitution, drafted in the 1990s and enacted with the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act in 1900, explicitly denied Indigenous peoples citizenship and the right to vote in federal elections, consigning them to a legal and social invisibility that echoed across generations. By the late 1800s, Aboriginal people had been dispossessed from much of their land, their populations devastated by disease and conflict, and their cultures marginalised through government policies that sought assimilation or removal rather than recognition. While some Indigenous voices resisted and continued to fight for their rights, such efforts were largely ignored in the political forums dominated by white settlers. This systematic erasure contributed to the false myth of a terra nullius, a land without prior ownership or civilization that had justified European settlement from the outset. Meanwhile, the prevailing attitude toward race and immigration hardened into what would become known as the White Australia policy. While the gold rushes had brought a wave of Chinese and other Asian migrants, by the 1880s and 1890s, fears of economic competition and racial difference fueled exclusionary laws. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, passed soon after Federation, was the legislative embodiment of this mindset, imposing a dictation test designed to limit non-European immigration. Its roots can be traced back through debates of the late 19th century, where many politicians and settlers articulated a vision of Australia as a white man's country, a phrase that was heard in the corridors of power and among everyday Australians alike. What strikes me when reading the testimonies and letters from this time is the tension between the ideal of mateship and egalitarianism, the celebrated Australian values, and the realities of social exclusion. You find this contradiction everywhere. The bush heroism of figures like Ned Kelly is lionised, but at the same time, laws discriminated against Chinese miners and denied Indigenous peoples basic rights. The same newspapers that celebrated the hard-working settler also printed racist editorials and advocated for policies that entrenched inequality. There are voices from the period that remind us of this complexity. For example, the Queensland Indigenous activist and elder, Udaru Nunical, writing much later, reflected on the century past with both sorrow and strength. Australia was built on Aboriginal land, yet we were made invisible by the new nation's laws and stories. To understand Australia, you must remember those who were here before the flags were raised. Even in the broader cultural landscape, Indigenous histories were often sidelined or romanticised in ways that denied their ongoing presence and rights. The early Australian museums and historical societies largely focused on settler achievements, collecting artifacts with little regard for their cultural significance to living communities. This cultural erasure was part of a wider pattern of displacement and denial that continued well into the 20th century. Yet, if you look closely, the late 19th century was not devoid of resistance or hope. Aboriginal leaders and communities maintained their traditions and asserted their rights, often in the face of overwhelming odds. Petitions and public speeches from Indigenous activists reveal an ongoing struggle to claim a place within the evolving nation. These moments remind us that history is never one-sided or static. It is full of voices pushing back against injustice. Looking at the political leaders of the day, many celebrated the Federation as a victory for democracy, but it was a democracy limited by the standards of today. Henry Parkes, often called the father of Federation, spoke of unity and national pride, but his vision did not extend to all who lived on the continent. It's a reminder that progress is often uneven, and that the ideals we cherish can coexist with uncomfortable realities. The economic transformations of the time also played a role. The pastoral industry, mining, and growing cities created wealth for some, while workers in urban areas began organizing for better conditions, inspired in part by international labor movements. The 1890s saw strikes and political ferment, laying early foundations for the Australian Labor Party. This growing political awareness added another layer to the complex story of Australia's formation. On a personal note, when I think about these contradictions, the hope and the exclusion, the celebration and the sorrow, it reminds me how important it is to listen carefully to the quieter stories beneath the headlines. History is not just about dates or grand events, but about people living complicated lives, negotiating identities, and imagining futures. There is something deeply human about that struggle, and it invites us to reflect on what kind of stories we choose to tell today. The legacy of the 19th century, then, is not a simple one. The nation that emerged in 1901 carried with it the marks of its foundations, both the pioneering spirit that built cities and railways, and the systemic injustices that denied full participation to many. This duality would shape Australian society throughout the 20th century, and remains part of its ongoing conversation about identity, reconciliation, and belonging. As the Commonwealth of Australia officially came into being on January 1st, 1901, with Edmund Barton as its first Prime Minister, the country stood at a crossroads. The promise of federation was real, but so too were the shadows cast by the choices made in those formative years. These shadows remind us that history is not fixed, but a living dialogue between past and present. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Australia's early history. I hope this story has offered you a calm space to reflect on the layers beneath the surface of the nation's beginnings. If you found this documentary thoughtful or inspiring, a gentle like or subscribe helps keep these stories alive and shared. Until next time, may your night be peaceful and your curiosity ever bright. Good night.